In the far reaches of the galaxy, there are no heroes, only survivors. Imagine the unending roar of artillery, the ceaseless grind of tank treads across ash-covered soil, and the choking fumes of promethium fires that never die. Here, an ordinary soldier of the Astra Militarum has no illusions of glory. They march not for conquest, but because the Emperor demands it. Each dawn brings no promise of safety, only the knowledge that the next hour may be their last. Survival in this universe is not about strength or valor, it is about clinging to fragments of humanity amidst the machinery of endless war. Every ration eaten in silence, every whispered prayer to the Emperor, every moment stolen between bombardments is a rebellion against the inevitability of death. These soldiers are not etched in marble, nor sung in hymns. They exist in the shadows of titans and custodians. Yet without them, the Imperium itself would collapse. To live in Warhammer 40K, as one of the countless conscripts, is to wrestle daily with despair and still rise when the Vox command calls. Their story is not one of victory, but of endurance. Before we descend into the trenches and walk beside these men and women who hold the line against nightmares beyond comprehension, take a moment to strengthen our own ranks here. Subscribe, share, and let your voice join ours, so together we can continue exploring the forgotten stories and fragile lives buried in the grim darkness of the far future. The barracks stank of iron and oil, a scent that clung to the recycled air no matter how many layers of disinfectant the servitors sprayed across the decking. It was not a living smell, not the earth or grass of a home world, but the stale temps of metal corridors and machine heat. I could taste it every time I swallowed, bitter and heavy, as if the troop ship itself exhaled into my lungs. The armor issued to us was no better pressed plates of flak that dug into the collarbone, straps too long or too short, every edge rubbing the skin raw. They had measured our height, our weight, the span of our shoulders, and still the uniform fit like a punishment. The Munitorum did not care. Fit or not, we wore the Aquila on our chest. And that was enough. We stood in silence, rank after crooked rank, boots scuffing against the grated floor as men shifted to ease the pressure on aching feet. Some breathed too quickly, trying to steady themselves. Others muttered half-remembered prayers under their breath, fingers brushing the crude carvings of saints or tokens smuggled past inspection. I found myself staring at the lasgun in my hands, its weight dragging at my arms. They told us it was a tool of victory, the Emperor's light-given form. But it felt more like a stone around the neck of a drowning man. The barrel caught the sickly yellow glow of the lumen strips overhead, dull and lifeless. I wondered if I would ever see it fire in anger, or if it would remain a burden carried until it crushed me. The barracks doors remained sealed, the Vox grill above them silent. Outside, in the vastness beyond steel walls, the troop ship hung in orbit over a world none of us had yet seen. They had told us nothing of its name, only that it was contested ground, that our lives had been tithed to hold it in the Emperor's name. Rumors spread among the recruits, whispers about orcs, about heretics, about enemies who could carve through a regiment as easily as flame through paper. The more I listened, the more my own heartbeat roared in my ears, drowning their words. One of the men, a thin-faced recruit from Valen Secundus, began to shake. His armor rattled as if he were already under fire. I thought the drill sergeants would drag him out and make an example of him, but none came. Perhaps they were listening to, from behind their hidden observation ports, measuring which of us would break first. The silence pressed heavier with every passing moment. I tried to breathe deeply, to steady myself, but even the recycled air seemed poisoned. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth, dry as ash. Around me the others fidgeted, and in those tiny movements I felt the same truth binding us all. We were faceless to the Imperium, mere bodies shaped into uniforms, names scratched into endless rolls of muster sheets. Yet inside each uniform was a storm of fear, pounding hearts ready to be spent in a single order. None of us mattered. All that mattered was that we filled the line when the doors opened. The floor trembled beneath our boots. At first I thought it was only my legs, too weak to bear the weight of armor and dread. But then the vibration deepened into the bones of the ship. A low, distant thunder rolled through the hull, echoing off the steel bulkheads, like a heartbeat not our own. The orbital cannons had fired, the sound cut through every whispered prayer, silencing the words on trembling lips. No commissar barked an order, no officer gave command. The ship itself had spoken, and with its voice came the truth. War had begun. I gripped the lasgun tighter, its cold weight pressing harder against my palms. Around me no one moved, yet everything had changed. The barracks was no longer a waiting room. It was a cage, and we were already inside the jaws. The vibration faded, leaving only the memory of its echo and the shiver crawling down my spine. I looked to the sealed doors, knowing that soon they would open, and with that single motion, we would no longer be men from scattered worlds. We would be soldiers of the Astra Militarum, tools in the Emperor's will, hurled into the furnace of eternity, and in that silence after the guns, I realized the uniform was no longer cloth, no longer armor. It was a chain, and it had locked shut. The silence did not last. It fractured with a dry crackle as the Vox grills above our heads came alive, their steel mouths spitting static across the barracks. At first it was only noise, a harsh buzz like teeth grinding in the dark. But then the voices broke through, distorted, metallic, yet heavy with the weight of command. Each syllable dragged like a chain across the spine, equal parts instruction and condemnation. Stand ready. By his will, you march. By his light, you endure. The words blurred together, half orders, half catechisms. Their edges lost to distortion, yet their meaning burned clear. We were not men to be reasoned with. We were offerings to be placed upon the altar of war. Every voice carried the same tone, stripped of humanity, as though no commander truly spoke, but rather the Emperor himself, distant and unyielding through the filter of broken machinery. Some recruits lowered their heads, mouthing responses to prayers they had been taught as children, their lips moving in rhythm to the hollow sermon. Others stood stiff, eyes fixed forward, as if daring the ceiling to strike them down. I listened, caught between obedience and doubt, my heart thudding louder with each broken phrase. Could a voice so mangled by static still be divine? Or was it simply another machine reminding us we had no choice? Beside me, Jaren Avalant, the same man whose armor had rattled with fear moments earlier, clutched something against his chest. In the dim glow I saw it, a tiny pendant of the Imperial Aquila, edges worn smooth from years of touch. His thumb traced the wings again and again, as though the motion itself could summon protection. Across the row, another recruit sealed his helmet with fumbling hands, the hiss of the locks echoing sharp and final, like a coffin lid being nailed shut. It was in these gestures, not the orders, that I felt the truth of us. Fragile men pressed into armor that did not fit, clinging to tokens, prayers, and trembling rituals to keep the abyss at bay. The Vox continued, relentless. Your lives are not your own. They belong to the Emperor. Fear is the weapon of the foe. Faith is your shield. The words crawled across the walls, weaving into the metal until it felt as though the ship itself was whispering into my ear. And yet beneath the thunder of liturgy, smaller sounds broke through, the grinding of a nervous jaw, the rasp of dry lips, the faint tremor of fingers tapping against lasgun casings. Confessions, each one, not in words, but in the raw language of fear and defiance. I found myself staring at my lasgun again, tracing the serial code stamped into the side. My father had once told me that names had power. This weapon had none, just a number. I wondered if I, too, was nothing more than that, a number on a list, faceless and disposable. Perhaps we all were. The realization settled heavy in my stomach, bitter as rust. And yet, against all reason, I tightened my grip on the gun, as though it were more than metal, though in holding it, I might hold on to some fragment of control. Then the lights shifted. Without warning, the steady yellow glow of the lumen strips guttered and flared, drowning us in a wash of crimson. The barracks transformed in an instant, steel turned to blood, shadows lengthened into gaping wounds, and every man was bathed in the color of sacrifice. For a heartbeat, no one moved. We stood frozen, staring at one another as if the Emperor himself had passed judgment and marked us for death. The klaxons followed. Their howl tore through the ship, deep and unrelenting, rattling the walls and sinking into the marrow. It was not a sound meant to be heard. It was a sound meant to consume, to remind us that the time for hesitation had ended. The red light pulsed in rhythm with the alarm, bathing our faces again and again until I could no longer tell where my skin ended and the stain of war began. My chest tightened, breath shallow, every instinct begging me to flee. But there was nowhere to go. The doors ahead remained shut, the orders above continued to drone, and the klaxons howled on. We were caught between command and abyss, between prayer and the silence that waits beyond. And in that moment, I realized the barracks had ceased to be a cage. It had become a confessional. Each man's fear, each whispered prayer, each trembling motion had already been laid bare. What came next would strip away even that. The alarms rose to a scream. The light burned brighter. Somewhere beyond those sealed doors waited the war itself, and we fragile, trembling. Faceless were already being pulled into its jaws. The dropship shuddered like a beast tearing itself free of its chains. The latches groaning as clamps released and the hull lurched into the void. My stomach hitched as the world tilted, gravity seizing us by the bones and dragging us downward. Straps bit into my shoulders, the harness rattling against the flak plates, as though it too feared what was coming. For a moment there was only silence, the endless pause between separation and descent. Then the engines roared, a sound that consumed everything, shaking my teeth in my skull and pressing the breath from my lungs. Through the armored viewport, the stars vanished, replaced by the glow of atmosphere catching fire. The ship screamed against the air as it carved its way through the heavens, a meteor with a belly full of souls. The view outside burned bright, orange and white tongues of flame licking across the reinforced glass until it felt as though we were flying inside the heart of a furnace. The heat pressed inward, seeping through the bulkheads, carried by recycled air that tasted metallic and bitter, like copper on the tongue. Sweat slicked the inside of my collar, dripping down the curve of my neck, though the air itself was thin and cold. The vibrations grew worse. Hammering through the deck and into our bodies, each bone rattled as if eager to break, each breath stolen by the thunder of descent. Someone shouted a prayer, but the words were lost, swallowed by the howl of engines straining against gravity's wrath. Others shouted too, not words, just raw sound, the primal cry of men realizing they were falling too fast, too hard. My own voice stayed locked inside my chest, but my hands clenched white against the straps. Knuckles aching as I held on as if grip alone might save me, the descent blurred time. Seconds stretched into eternities, each heartbeat louder than the next, each breath a struggle against fear and pressure. I thought of Terra, its shining palaces, which I had never seen. But the vision painted in the catechisms, a golden throne in endless light, eternal and unyielding. If I died here, in this screaming coffin of steel, would I even glimpse that light? Or would I vanish as so many others had, lost nameless in the dark between stars? The ship lurched violently, throwing us sideways in our restraints. The man across from Majoran, still clutching his Aquila pendant, bit down on his lip so hard, blood smeared across his chin. But he did not let go of that tiny piece of faith. The red lumen strips flickered in the cabin, shadows jerking across helmets and armor like specters clawing at the walls. The air reeked of sweat, ozone, and promethium residue from the thrusters, thick enough to taste with every gasping breath. The closer we fell, the sharper the fear became. It was no longer the vague dread of waiting in barracks, no longer the trembling anticipation of orders over vox grills. This was immediate, inescapable. Survival shrieked in every nerve, a desperate instinct flaring like a match struck in darkness. If the ship cracked, if the engines failed, if a single plate gave way, we would not burn in battle, we would be ash scattered in the stratosphere. Forgotten before the war had even begun, a sudden jolt slammed us back in our seats, the restraints carving lines into shoulders and chests. Retro thrusters screamed, their roar louder than anything before, sound so fierce it felt as though the air itself was tearing apart. My vision blurred as my head snapped forward, the impact rattling down my spine. Then came the shudder-violent, bone-deep tremor that told us the descent was ending, that the ground itself was rising to meet us. The engines howled one final time, then cut short with a thunderous cough. The silence that followed was brief, too brief, broken by the grinding shriek of metal as the ramp began to lower. A flood of air burst inside, thick with smoke, acrid with promethium, and hot with the heat of a world already aflame. Beyond the narrowing gap, the horizon glowed red, fire and ruin painting the sky. And as the ramp ground lower, every heart clenched tight with the same thought. The descent was over. The war was about to begin. The ramp did not open so much as scream, its hydraulics shrieking against the strain as daylight or what passed for it poured in. But this was no gentle light. Smoke, ash, and fire rushed inside, smothering the dropship's stale air with the raw stench of promethium and blood. My eyes burned instantly, my lungs clawing for breath that was already poisoned. The first step forward was not courage. It was compulsion, bodies shoved by the tide of men who had no choice but to move. The ground swallowed us whole. The sound of the battlefield hit harder than gravity. Artillery thundered across the horizon, each detonation a brutal punctuation that rattled teeth and bones alike. Lasphia slashed through the haze in crimson streaks, sharp and merciless, carving through smoke to find flesh. The earth trembled beneath us as shells struck, dirt and charred rock raining down in sheets. The Emperor's light felt impossibly distant, as though no prayer could reach through the storm of vox static and screams. Every voice on the coms was broken, commands drowned. Faith twisted into static that offered no salvation. The first breath nearly killed me. I gagged on it, ash thick on my tongue, grit grinding against my teeth. The tang of iron coated my throat, unmistakable. The taste of blood carried on the wind long before I saw who had spilled it. A man stumbled at my side, his helmet lost, face blackened by soot and terror. He tried to cry out, but his voice was swallowed by the storm, his words lost before they left his lips. He fell into the mud, forgotten before anyone even knew his name. I raised my lasgun, though my hands shook violently, stock rattling against my armor like it did not belong to me. Training drills flashed in my memory, clean ranges, straight lines, instructors barking precision. Here, nothing was straight. Nothing was clean. Smoke churned and hid the world, shadows twisting into monsters, the outlines of orcs or worse flickering at the edge of sight. I realized then that fear had a weight heavier than any flak plate, and still I bore it, because the alternative was to collapse. And collapsing was death. Voices cracked over the vox grills, half screams, half orders, forward. By his will, forward. But which direction was forward when the ground itself split and heaved beneath bombardment? We stumbled, slipped, clawed our way through craters already filling with smoke. The sky itself was burning, a ceiling of fire and shadow. The noise was too much. My mind rebelled against it, seeking silence where none existed, praying for a pause in the storm. But war has no silence. Only layers of sound stacked atop one another until the world itself becomes a weapon. Somewhere ahead, a recruit broke. He tore his helmet free and screamed, not words, just raw terror, before a beam of less fire tore him open mid-sentence. He fell in 2 jerks and was gone, nothing left but a smoking shape half buried in mud. No one stopped to look. No one could. Survival demanded forward movement, and mercy was a luxury war did not afford. I saw men whispering prayers, their lips moving against the grit, their words breaking as quickly as their voices. Faith was fragile here. Yet it persisted, as though clinging to it in defiance of the galaxy's indifference was an act of rebellion itself. I staggered, nearly fell, caught myself with the lasgun pressed into the mud. The grit scraped along the barrel, grinding beneath my gloves. Somewhere close, an explosion lit the haze white and orange, the heat searing across my cheek like a hand pressed too long against fire. The shockwave knocked men sprawling, helmets cracking against stone, armor clattering. I lay in the dirt for a breathless moment, every sense battered by sound and fury, before pushing myself upright again. It was not choice. It was reflex, and that was when it struck me. Every step forward, every breath drawn, was an act of defiance. Not against the enemy alone, but against the sheer immensity of war itself, the machine that devoured flesh and spirit without distinction. Even survival felt like heresy, blasphemy against the truth that the galaxy did not care whether we lived or died. Still, I raised my head. Smoke curled around me, the sky a boiling wound of fire and ruin, and I breathed again, harsh, ragged, but mine. That was the moment. The first breath of war. The trench does not welcome you. It swallows you. Every step sinks half a foot into mud slick as oil, dragging your boots into the sucking earth until it feels as though the ground itself is trying to claim you. The walls around you bleed rainwater, collapsing inward in slow slides of grit and clay, and the air is thick with the stench of mildew. Rotting meat and promethium smoke that never quite clears. Each breath feels borrowed, each swallow of the damp air laced with iron and mold. Above it all, the earth trembles with the endless roll of artillery. A vibration that seeps into your bones until you forget what stillness ever felt like. This is the world of the Astra Militarum, and its most unadorned. Strip of earth clawed open by men and left to rot in the rain. There are no banners here, no bright colors of the parade ground, no heroic music. Only the rasp of water dripping from rusted helmets and the drone of flies fattened on the dead. Soldiers huddle under makeshift tarps stitched from rags and scavenged canvas, their shoulders pressed close in the narrow trench as if proximity alone can keep the cold from seeping into marrow. When the rain intensifies, voices fade. When it slackens, the silence feels heavier. Every piece of gear seems cursed by the mud. Lasgun charges foul in their casings, the grit working its way into power packs until even the Emperor's light sputters. Bayonets rust red. Armor plates grow slick with slime. Men scrub until their hands bleed, but the filth always returns, as if the trench itself insists on marking them as its own. The veterans don't curse it anymore. They only shake their heads, mutter a litany beneath breath, and move on. Faith is quieter here, not the shouted sermons of the chaplain, but whispered fragments of prayer. Words mouthed into cupped hands like secrets too fragile for the air. And yet, against this erosion of flesh and spirit, patterns form. A guardsman scratches the outline of the Imperial Aquila into the wall with a combat knife. Jagged lines etched between rivulets of rain. Others add their marks until the clay shimmers with wings and two-headed gazes, crude but defiant. In the darkest hours, a dented tin passes hand to hand, steaming with recaf so bitter it tastes of ash. They drink it anyway, savoring the warmth on their tongues as though it were the Emperor's blessing. Some hum snatches of hymns learned in childhood, notes so faint they are almost mistaken for the wind. Threading through torn sandbags, it is in these rituals that survival begins to feel less like chance and more like will. The trench may choke, the mud may devour, the sky may collapse in fire. But the soldiers of the Astra Militarum cling to what scraps they can. They carve, they hum, they share. In that persistence lies a form of defiance the enemy can never shell into dust. Still, the trench is not a sanctuary. Every sound beyond the parapet is measured, dissected, and feared. The night carries noises that do not belong to rain or thunder. A scrape of metal, too deliberate to be debris. A shuffle too heavy to be the wind. The silence that follows makes hearts race harder than artillery ever could. Some guardsmen swear they hear breathing out there, as though the very darkness leans against the edge of the trench, listening. Tonight is worse. The air feels colder, the rain quieter. Every drop seems muffled, smothered before it hits the ground. Then it comes, not thunder, not shell fire, but the sound of weight pressing into sodden earth. Heavy steps, measured and patient, moving through no man's land. The trench falls into absolute silence, every soldier holding breath. Lasgun's trembling in hands suddenly slick with sweat. The mud, the ash, the rations. The whispered prayers, none of it matters when the night itself grows teeth. The taste of iron lingers on the tongue long before the rations arrive. It rides in the rain that drips from trench walls, in the metallic temps of recycled water sloshed into dented canteens, in the air itself, heavy with the scent of rusting helmets and old blood buried in the mud. By the time the quartermaster comes trudging down the line, shoulders hunched beneath a pack that looks heavier than he does, no one expects food. What he carries is not sustenance, but a sentence. Dense corpse-starch bricks pressed into shape like gravestones. Crumbly edges flaking into dust before they touch your lips. You chew because you must, not because you want to. Each bite grinds into a paste that sticks to your teeth, coating the back of your throat until swallowing feels like choking. Some soldiers hold their noses shut to trick themselves into believing it has no taste at all. Others mutter curses with every mouthful, spitting between chews as if to purge themselves of the indignity. The recycled water filtered so many times it carries the memory of every death it passed through only makes it worse. It tastes of iron, of rust, and faint copper sweetness, as though each sip reminds you that someone else's blood has been here before. The Munitorum calls it efficiency. Calories calculated to the exact measure of labor. Nutrients balanced with the precision of a forge. The same logic that builds Lasgun batteries, that counts tanks as numbers and guardsmen as expendable parts. To them, a soldier's hunger is not a plea, it is an equation. And as you swallow another mouthful of dust that pretends to be bread, you understand that the machine that feeds you is the same one that will grind you into silence when the time comes. And yet, humanity is stubborn. Even here in the belly of despair, men and women find ways to reclaim fragments of themselves. One guardsman breaks his ration brick in half and trades it for a whispered story of home, field of wheat so tall it brushed the sky, or a market where the scent of roasted groks drifted through the streets like perfume. Another barters away his stale bread for a single pull from a contraband flask of amasec. The burn in his throat so sharp it almost feels alive. They gather in huddles, backs pressed to crumbling walls, passing scraps and words alike, stitching moments of warmth into the cold fabric of their survival. Sometimes, laughter even dares to rise. It comes brittle and fleeting, the crack of a joke so absurd it forces a smile. The memory of a festival danced back on Terra or some distant hive world where music once drowned out the drudgery. The sound is out of place here, jagged against the rain and the drone of flies. But it cuts through the trench like light in a cavern. For a moment, it almost feels like rebellion, a declaration that the machine cannot have everything. That despair will not be the only song sung in the dark, but laughter is fragile and war is hungry. The first warning is not sight, but sound. A whistle so faint it barely pierces the air, carried on the wind like a shriek from some unseen predator. Every head snaps upward, eyes searching the gray sky beyond the lip of the trench. Then comes the second whistle, sharper, closer. And suddenly the ration bricks scatter into the mud as men and women dive for cover. The world erupts. Shellfire screams into the earth, tearing it open with thunderous fists. Walls collapse inward, drowning soldiers in cascades of muck and rain. The air is fire and ash, the acrid taste of promethium mingling with the iron already coating every tongue. Screams rise, half choked by dust, bodies thrown against the trench wall as if rag dolls in the hand of some monstrous child. The laughter, the stories, the thin threads of humanity unravel in an instant. Consumed by the returning maw of war, in the space of a heartbeat, the meal is over, and the trench remembers what it was always meant to be, a grave waiting to be filled. When the guns fall silent, the trench does not breathe relief. It holds its breath. The world, moments ago, a cacophony of fire and thunder, becomes something worse. A stillness so thick it presses against the lungs. Ash drifts through the air like snow, coating every surface in gray. The ground trembles with the aftershocks of the bombardment, each vibration a phantom echo of shells already spent. You can feel the quiet thrum beneath your boots, as if the earth itself remembers the violence and refuses to let it go. In that silence, soldiers learn to fear absence more than presence. Noise means you know where death is coming from. Quiet means it could be anywhere. Helmets tilt upward toward the night sky, though there is nothing to see, no stars, no moons, only the endless veil of smoke. Some swear they glimpse the faint glow of the Astronomicon bleeding faintly through the shroud, like the trace of a candle glimpsed through a fogged window. Others say It is only imagination. The desperate trick of weary eyes longing for proof that the Emperor's light has not abandoned them. Exhaustion hangs over the trench like a pall. Heads nod against lasgan stocks, the rhythm of weariness as steady as any drumbeat. A trooper mutters a half-forgotten prayer, carving the Imperial Aquila into the wood of her weapon with a dull knife, each stroke slower than the last. Another hums a hymn too softly to hear the words, the melody carrying more weight than the meaning. Somewhere down the line, a burst of laughter flickers brittle, hollow, a ghost of something human. It vanishes as quickly as it arrives, leaving only the rain to fill the gap. Sleep comes, but never gently. Men and women slump against the trench wall, slipping into dreams that cut sharper than waking life. They see fields they will never walk again. Children whose faces blur more with each night, cities that no longer exist outside memory. Terra is whispered like a prayer, like a wound. And when sleep turns cruel, nightmares come. Visions of bayonets flashing in the dark, of drowning in mud, of comrades screaming their names as the earth swallows them whole. Often, those screams are not dreams at all, but the distant cries carrying across no man's land. Proof that silence is only an illusion. The air grows heavier as the hours stretch. A weight that settles into bones, a reminder that even peace here is poisoned. Silence, in its own way, becomes another weapon. It gnaws at nerves, makes hands twitch on triggers, stretches minutes into eternities, where every soldier waits for the inevitable. You begin to understand that the quiet does not mean safety. It means the enemy is listening to. Then, without warning, the sky changes. A hiss, a crackle, and the first flare claws upward, splitting the dark with blinding light. For an instant, the battlefield is exposed, bathed in a glow that turns mud to molten bronze and corpses into grotesque statues. Shadows stretch long across the trench, grotesque shapes bending over the living like specters. Soldiers lift their heads, eyes wide, knuckles white against their weapons. The silence has ended, and in the false dawn of flares, every heart remembers the truth. Here, quiet is never peace. It is only the prelude to fire. Chapter 3. The Commissar's presence was not a man, but a shadow. A shape that seemed to stretch across the trench no matter where he stood. His bolt pistol hung at his side, gleaming faintly with the sheen of ritual oil. Polished so carefully it might have been mistaken for a relic. It was more than a weapon. It was a verdict. Every soldier knew it, even if no word was spoken. Eyes dropped whenever his gaze swept the line, for to meet it was to feel judgment crawl beneath the skin like ice. He didn't need to shout. His silence carried the weight of execution. I felt his presence before I ever turned my head. A chill that made my hands tighten around the grip of my lasgan, its stock damp with sweat and mud. Around me, others shifted uneasily, boots grinding into the slick earth as if even standing still under that gaze demanded effort. The air thickened with a tension sharper than any incoming shell. The knowledge that the enemy was not the only one who could kill you. Here, obedience was not just expected. It was survival. Above the trench, orders came crackling through the vox grills. Distorted and distant, as though the voices belonged to ghosts perched far from the mud and blood. Commanders somewhere deep in safety spoke of maneuvers, of timings, of victories yet to be won. Their words arrived hollow, carried by static and duty, while down here the cost was measured in bone and breath. The Commissar enforced that bridge between worlds, the voice of distant power, turned into immediate consequence. You could taste the fear in the air, metallic, like iron scraped across teeth. Every movement, every shuffle of a boot or click of a lasgan's charge pack seemed amplified. No one dared let their hands tremble too openly. No one dared murmur prayers too loudly. Even faith, in the shadow of the bolt pistol, became a private act. I heard one trooper beside me whisper the litany of protection beneath his breath, his voice so faint it seemed meant for the mud itself rather than the Emperor. His eyes never rose from the trench wall. He knew better. The paradox pressed in on us all. The Commissar was there to make us strong, but the strength he drew from us was forged in terror. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for thought. A misstep in battle could be forgiven by the Emperor if death claimed you quickly enough. But a misstep under the Commissar's watch was another matter. It meant shame, accusation, a bolt round fired without pause. His weapon was not raised often, but it did not need to be. Its presence was enough to make obedience absolute. When he finally spoke, his voice carried like a blade slicing through smoke. Clipped, direct, devoid of warmth. He did not need to shout. Each word carved its place into us, settling like stones in the gut. The order to prepare, to advance, to move where the battlefield demanded, came not as suggestion, but as decree. I felt my throat tighten. Even the mud seemed to recoil, slicking down the trench walls as if shrinking back from the inevitability to come. There was no moment to question, no chance to pause. We did not march for glory, nor even for the hope of victory. We marched because the alternative was death at our own hands, because a bolt pistol at the back was swifter than any mercy the enemy might grant. The Commissar's shadow was heavier than the packs on our backs, heavier than the last guns we carried. And yet in that weight we moved. Then came the command. Through the Vox grills, through the Commissar's voice, through every fiber of the machine that was the Astra Militarum, the single order cut through the night like a blade. Advance. The word was both a sentence and a release, tearing away the stillness, throwing us forward into the waiting teeth of the front. The shadow of the bolt pistol followed us, and the only choice left was to step into the storm ahead. The order to advance came like a lash, cutting through the chaos with cruel clarity. One word repeated through Vox grills and bellowed by officers desperate to prove their worth. Forward. It was never a command for victory. It was a demand for sacrifice. And so we moved, boots dragging through churned mud, thick with blood. Lasguns clutched, like lifelines as the world above the trench swallowed us whole. The battlefield did not resemble land, so much as a furnace given form. Smoke rolled low and choking, mixed with the chemical bite of promethium flames that licked across broken earth. Ash rained from the sky, clinging to lips and lashes, blinding and suffocating until every breath tasted like iron scraped raw. The air itself burned, seared by less fire that crisscrossed in endless sheets of red, tracing patterns of death against the smoke-thick horizon. Every meter clawed forward was counted not in distance, but in bodies. A trooper pitched ahead of me, his chest erupting in a burst of vapor as a shot found its mark. He collapsed into the mud, and before the spray of blood even settled, another filled the space he had left, charging onward without pause. That was how we advanced. One falls, another takes his place. A human tide pushing against the storm until the line itself blurred into nothing but motion and screams. Orders poured through the Vox in distorted fragments, their voices layered over one another in a mechanical litany that knew nothing of flesh. Advance. Advance. Do not break. Advance. Even when the ground was a killing field, when Lasfear scorched the air so hot it blistered exposed skin, the orders never faltered. To stop was to fail. To fail was to die under a bolt pistol instead of an enemy's gun. The Imperium demanded nothing less than progress. Even if progress meant crawling over the dead, yet in the heart of that slaughter something fragile refused to vanish. I saw two guardsmen stumble back into cover, dragging a third between them, his leg little more than shreds of cloth and charred bone. Their arms locked beneath his shoulders, hauling him through muck that sucked at every step, faces twisted with effort and defiance. For a heartbeat, almost believed there was room for mercy in war. Almost a squad ahead of us vanished in a wash of fire, their silhouettes swallowed by the detonation of a promethium tank. But when the smoke cleared, a single figure still stood, a young standard-bearer who had somehow kept hold of the Imperial Aquila. His armor was blackened, his arm burned raw, yet he rammed the banner into the scorched ground and screamed the Emperor's name until his voice was nothing but hoarse static. Around him, others rallied, if only for seconds before another barrage cut them down. Prayers rose louder than the guns. Ragged hymns shouted through cracked lips, verses spat like defiance against the void. The Emperor protects. Men bellowed, even as artillery tore their bodies apart, even as the mud drank deep of them. The words were not proof of faith. They were weapons, chanted not to summon the Emperor's hand, but to hold together the fraying threads of sanity. Without them, the line would have broken. But faith did not alter the calculus of war. For every voice that rose in defiance, a dozen were silenced mid-sentence, torn apart before their words could fade. The truth weighed heavier than armor. Survival was never earned by valor. It was obedience alone that preserved us, the machine grinding forward without pause. Orders were fire and we were parchment, consumed meter by meter until nothing but ash remained. By the time the barrage subsided, the ground behind us was carpeted with the fallen. We did not look back. To look was to break. To break was to die. Ahead, the commissar's voice rose again, demanding another surge, another push into the teeth of guns that had never stopped firing. Exhaustion made limbs heavy, lungs burned with the acrid sting of smoke. And yet the word came once more, sharp as a blade across the throat. Advance. And so we did. The battlefield had grown quiet, but it was not peace that lingered in that silence. It was absence. The trenches were choked with the broken bodies sprawled half-buried in mud. Their armor caked so thick with ash that the imperial aquila upon their chests was nearly invisible. The vox grills, once alive with the shrill cadence of orders and catechisms, now whispered only static, a thin, hissing reminder of voices that no longer answered. Beyond that silence, the distant growl of engines stirred, low and steady, promising another advance before the wounds of this one could even be counted. Those of us still breathing sat slumped against the sodden earthworks, lasguns resting across our knees, eyes glassed over with the dull weight of exhaustion. We did not speak at first. Words seemed too fragile, too easily broken against the press of smoke that rolled across the killing field. When voices did rise, they came in whispers, not hymns, not prayers, but rumors, spoken like confessions. Some said the astronomicon itself was dimming, its holy light flickering beyond the warp, too distant to touch the mire we drowned in. Others murmured that the Emperor's gaze could not possibly stretch here, to this nameless trench on this forgotten world. Faith, once a shield, had thinned into something brittle. We clutched at it like men drowning, though every breath suggested we were already lost beneath the tide. I heard one trooper, his hands trembling, mutter the same line over and over. He sees me. He sees me. He sees me. But there was no conviction left in his tone, only fear that if he stopped saying it, the truth would rush in and hollow him out completely. The commissar did not care for these whispers. His boots cut through the mud with the same mechanical certainty as always, his bolt pistol gleaming with its cold promise. When he stepped forward, heads rose. Not out of reverence, not out of devotion, but out of reflex. A bone-deep knowledge carved into us all that obedience was the only path left. To remain seated would mean death here, in the trench, and so we rose. Hollow-eyed, hollow-souled, but upright all the same. In that moment, I understood the true price of obedience. It was not only the blood left in the mud, not only the comrades lost and the banners burned away to ash. It was the slow erosion of humanity itself, stripped away piece by piece with every order obeyed. We had become extensions of command, movements without thought, mouths without voices. The line between man and machine blurred until only fear remained to guide us. The stillness stretched, heavy, suffocating, broken only by the sound of flies buzzing over the fallen, and the occasional crack of settling rubble where artillery had torn the earth apart. For a fleeting instant, I allowed myself to imagine what silence might feel like if it lasted. But the thought was fragile, already unraveling. It's already mocked by the inevitability that pressed closer with every heartbeat. And then it came. The vox crackled, sharp and sudden, as if spitting sparks into the silence. Static bled into words, clipped and iron-bound. Another command, another demand to move forward. Around me, shoulders stiffened, feet shifted. Lasguns were lifted, hands fumbling with half-spent charge packs. No one cursed. No one prayed. We simply obeyed. The commissar raised his hand, the shadow of the bolt pistol falling across us like a sentence. We moved as one, faceless and hollow. Stepping once more into the fire, The lumen lamps stuttered in their sockets, coughing weak light across the trench walls. Each flicker carved new shadows from the mud, twisting them into shapes that leaned close, listening. We huddled near the glow, boots sinking into the damp, rifles set just within reach. No one spoke at first. The quiet was too thick, too heavy. It pressed down on our chests like a weight, a silence born not of peace, but of exhaustion. As though the war itself had drawn breath and was holding it. It was the youngest of us who broke it. A thin-voiced trooper from Calth, barely old enough to grow stubble, was muttering about footsteps in the tunnels that ran beneath the line. He swore he'd heard them during his last watch, a measured tread. Too heavy for rats, too deliberate for the shifting earth. His words trembled in the air, and though some chuckled, the laughter was thin and forced. No one wanted to admit they'd heard something too. The vox grills crackled now and then. Ghost static, bleeding into half-formed syllables that made the skin crawl. Orders, perhaps caught in the machine's memory, or voices that should not have been speaking. One sergeant spat into the mud and swore it was just scrapco, machine spirits gnawing at their own circuits. But his hands didn't stop trembling as he spoke, and he wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Stories grew out of the dark like weeds. One man told of a comrade answering his name across the wire, only to find the man still asleep beside him. Another swore he'd heard laughter, thin and reedy, slipping through the roar of artillery like a knife sliding between ribs. Each tale was offered in a whisper, as though volume itself might draw something closer. The lumen light flickered again, and every head turned toward it, as though its faint glow were the only barrier, holding back the abyss. We clung to those tales the way drowning men cling to driftwood. They gave shape to the unease that gnawed at us, turned the formless dark into something we could name. And yet every story was also poison. Once heard, it sank into the mind, whispering in the spaces between heartbeats. It made shadows deeper, silences sharper. The dark beyond the trench, an endless stage where unseen things waited their cue. I remember the smell most of all. Damp earth, soaked with promethium, the tents of rusting metal, the copper reek of blood, never fully washed from the mud. It all clung to us, a second skin of rot and memory. When the wind shifted, it carried with it the faint, oily stench of burnt flesh from the no-man's land. Against such smells, every whispered tale seemed all too believable. The longer we spoke, the more the trench itself seemed to close in. Every timber groaned like a voice half smothered. Every drip of water from the ceiling struck the mud with the weight of a heartbeat. I tried not to listen, tried to steady my breathing, but the silence between stories was worse than the stories themselves. It stretched too far, till I found myself waiting for a sound, any sound, to prove the world was still moving beyond these earthen walls. Then Corporel. Dresden gave a low hiss, sharp enough to still every tongue. He had been staring out toward the wire, his lasgan raised, his knuckles white on the grip. I followed his gaze, squinting into the black where lumen light faded into nothing. At first I saw only mist and smoke, the shifting veil of a battlefield refusing to rest. But then something moved. Tall. Too tall for a man. It drifted between the shattered stakes, silent where the wind hissed and the mud gurgled. A shape stretched wrong, its edges bleeding into the dark, as though it belonged more to shadow than to flesh. For a heartbeat I thought it was smoke curling, but smoke did not walk. Dresden swore under his breath. The others leaned forward, their eyes wide, mouths open, but voiceless. No one reached for the vox. No one dared break the air with a sound. The thing lingered there at the wire, half seen, half born of fear, and we stared back, frozen between disbelief and the certainty that if we moved, it would notice. The lumen lamp above us flickered again, once, twice, and then dimmed to a dying glow. In that half-light, the wire rattled softly, as though something vast had brushed against it. We held our breath, waiting, listening, wondering if silence would keep us safe, or if it had already betrayed us. The trench seemed to breathe with us, its walls damp and close, its timbers groaning as though straining under the weight of everything we whispered into it. After the first stories of shadows and footsteps had run their course, the air shifted. Where fear alone had left us hollow, faith crept in like a hand reaching through the dark. Not the steady kind of faith that could be named in prayer, but the fractured sort that rises when men are too broken to hold silence any longer. Someone swore a lozbolt had curved mid-flight, arcing like a comet to strike an orc's skull clean through its helmet. He said it had been the Emperor's hand guiding it, proof that he watched even from the throne upon. Terra, another, spoke of a woman in white robes stepping across no man's land at dusk, untouched by shells, leaving a trail of light where her feet pressed into the mud. Her face, he said, was hidden beneath a veil, but her voice was like a hymn that steadied the heart. The story spread quick as fever, whispered with such conviction that even those who doubted could not help but glance into the dusk. Waiting for her to appear again, I wanted to believe. We all did. Hope had a taste in those moments, metallic and sharp, like biting down on a coin. It filled the mouth but never the belly, and still we clung to it. Because the alternative was to look only at the blood pooling in the dirt, at the faces that no longer opened their eyes when the lamps flickered. But for every tale of light, there was another that soured it. There were psychers among us, sanctioned by decree, their minds shackled by the Imperium's grim will. Some were praised as saints in flesh, their murmured prayers calling down fire that licked across the battlefield like a living sermon. Others were less stable. We had seen them twitch at nothing, staring into a distance no one else could see. Their whispers turned inward, then outward, until words broke apart into sounds too raw to belong to any tongue. Men began to keep their distance, crossing themselves with the sign of the Aquila when one passed too close. I remember a corporal saying that miracles and madness were the same thing seen from different sides. His face was ash-paled when he said it, his lips trembling around the words, and no one answered him. Because deep down, we knew he was right. The warp was too close to us here. We could feel it in the static that crawled across the vox, in the pressure behind our eyes whenever the night grew to still. The psychers were the cracks through which that pressure leaked, and though they stood in our ranks, none of us could decide whether they were shields or weapons aimed inward. The trench was full of contradictions. One man knelt in prayer, pressing his forehead into mud as if it were marble steps of a cathedral. Another carved runes into his lasgan stock. Not ecclesiarchy-sanctioned marks, but shapes, he claimed, warded off the warp. None of us stopped him. In the dark, we needed every kind of protection, even the kind that smelled of heresy. The air grew close, heavy with promethium fumes from the lamps and the sour temps of sweat soaked through flak armor. Every breath felt borrowed, every heartbeat too loud. The stories layered over each other until they blurred, miracles stacked against horrors. Salvation beside corruption, until we no longer knew which was truer. And maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the Emperor allowed both miracles and madness alike, as long as they kept us moving, kept us fighting. But then the balance broke. It came as a sound first, faint, at the edge of hearing, like stone cracking under strain. Then it grew a scream, sharp and jagged, tearing down the line with a force that made the hairs rise on our arms. It was a psycher's voice, unmistakable in its rawness, shrieking as though every nerve had been set aflame at once. The scream carried through the trench, bending the air, rattling the timbers, until even the lumen lamps sputtered and hissed. We froze, every tale forgotten in that instant, every whispered miracle drowned in the certainty of horror. Because some stories did not stay whispers. Some bled into the world, and when they did, they left scars deeper than any shell crater. The screaming did not stop. The trench had grown too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed into your ears until it felt like your own pulse was the only sound left in the galaxy. Beyond the wire, no man's land stretched out like a wound in the earth, shrouded in smoke that never quite cleared. We told ourselves the guns would start again, that the rhythm of shell and scream would return, because that was something we understood. But instead, the dark lingered, thick and watchful, and men began to glance at the horizon as if it were looking back. At first it was nothing more than tricks of the eyes. A glint caught in the fog, the suggestion of movement against the skeletal remains of manufacturing ruins. Then the whispers started, low and sharp, metallic silhouettes rising from the smoke. Tall and wrong, their forms vanishing before anyone could fix their gaze. Necron phantoms, someone said, watchers with eyes colder than any star, waiting with patience that could outlast empires. The name alone was enough to chill the blood. None of us wanted to believe it, but once spoken, it was impossible to unsay. Every soldier knew the scent of promethium and blood, but what settled over us that night was something different. The air itself carried a taste like copper left too long in the mouth. It's acrid and stale, as though the ground had soured under unseen weight. Voices swore they heard cries carried by the wind, screams stretched to thin, as though echoing from a place beyond flesh. Men who had stood firm under artillery now trembled at shadows. Some pressed their helmets tighter against their skulls, as if that thin layer of metal could shield them from what they could not name. I tried to steady my breathing, to remind myself that fear was just another weapon. The commissar's bolt pistol was enough to keep us moving, but here, in this pause between storms, discipline faltered. The Emperor's hymns were whispered, but they cracked like dry parchment, their strength eroded by doubt. Because what weapon could you raise against something that might not even be there? Against watchers that waited not for moments, but for centuries. The rumors thickened with each passing hour. A sentry claimed the Vox grill hissed with voices, not static, voices too clean, too cold, speaking in syllables that cut like glass. Another swore he saw eyes glow emerald in the smoke, steady and unblinking. Whether truth or madness, none of us knew. But the trench began to feel smaller, as if the walls themselves bent inward. As if the horizon leaned closer every time we blinked. I thought of Terra then, not its golden spires, which I had never seen, but of its promise. The Astronomican's light was said to reach us even here, even across war and night, guiding us in ways no man could measure. But under that smoke, under those watching shapes, the thought of his gaze felt fragile, like a candle shivering against a storm. And if the light faltered, what then? What was left when both faith and fear turned hollow? The sky offered no answers. It was a dome of ash and fireless stars, a vault that seemed empty even as it pressed down upon us. Some soldiers stopped speaking altogether, their silence heavier than any prayer. Others muttered prophecies, half-remembered from preachers whose faces they could no longer recall. "The dark does not hide fear," one man whispered. "It gives it form." His words clung to the trench like frost, refusing to melt. We waited, for shells, for orders, for anything that would remind us the war was made of flesh and steel and not of shadows. But nothing came. Only the smoke. Only the feeling of being watched by something patient, something that knew time was on its side. The thought hollowed us out more thoroughly than any bombardment could. When the night deepened, when even the lumen lamps sputtered low, a hush settled across the line. Not peace, not safety, just the final realization that survival here was no longer a certainty, but a rumor we told ourselves to keep from breaking. And as we braced in that silence, lasguns clutched like talismans. Every whisper carried the weight of prophecy, because in the dark it no longer mattered what was real. Only that it was coming. War in the 41st millennium does not end. It spreads, unceasing, like rot beneath the skin of the galaxy. Festering across worlds no cartographer could ever chart in full. The Imperium of man is a colossus that bleeds at every limb, and yet it marches on, fed by the endless procession of bodies pressed into uniform. To be one of those bodies is to understand a truth whispered by veterans and etched into the bones of the Astra Militarum. There is no final victory, only survival until the next campaign claims you. I remember the sound of it most, the rhythm that stitched us together, that hollow cadence of boots striking mud, of armor plates clattering against fatigued limbs, of breath drawn in unison as if the entire regiment were a single wheezing creature. It was not music, but compulsion. Every step forward was demanded, not chosen. We marched not toward triumph, not toward a horizon promising peace, but toward the next battlefield, waiting with jaws wide. The only end was the grave, and even that was no reprieve, for the administratum would tally your name, erase it beneath ink and parchment, and prepare to feed the next soul into the machine. The transports rattled like coffins on wheels. Within their metal bellies, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, silent, except for the occasional cough or whispered prayer. The air reeked of sweat, oil, and promethium residue, clinging to skin, no matter how long one scrubbed at it. Somewhere above, servitors hummed, their minds hollowed to keep the engines alive. The Vox grills crackled with orders in voices so distant they might have belonged to ghosts. Yet none of us dared speak back, for there was no dialogue in the Imperium. Only obedience. Comrades fell with such frequency that their absence ceased to feel remarkable. A man who slept beside you one night would be a corpse dragged to the pyres by dawn, his name already slipping from memory. Placed by another face, another voice, another set of boots filling the gap, we told ourselves we would remember them, that we would carry their stories home if home still existed. But the truth was harsher. War erased as much as it killed, and in the suffocating churn of campaigns, names faded like smoke on the wind. I tried to keep count once. Not of the fallen, for that was impossible, but of the worlds. The dust under our boots shifted from red to gray to ochre. The skies from choking smog to storms of ash to clouds heavy with rain that tasted of metal. Every planet carried the same weight in the end. Manufactorum ruins scattered like bones, trenches gouged into the earth. The scent of decay masking any memory of what had been there before, and always, always the banners of the Imperial Aquila raised against a backdrop of ruin, fluttering as if to remind us we belonged not to ourselves, but to a God we would never see. There were moments, fleeting, bitter moments, where silence threatened to break us. Between campaigns, when the guns quieted and the transports groaned across wastelands, we could hear the hollow truth pressing in. We were not marching toward victory. We were marching in circles, orbiting the maw of a war that had no end. The thought was forbidden, heretical even, but it bled into our bones regardless. What use was faith when each prayer ended in the same mud-soaked trenches, each hymn drowned by the roar of artillery? Still, we marched, because hesitation was punished, because obedience was survival, because even knowing the futility, no one wished to be the first to fall behind. The commissar's shadow hung over us even when unseen, the weight of his bolt pistol more certain than the Emperor's gaze. And so, our boots struck the ground, again and again, till the sound became indistinguishable from our own heartbeat. The horizon never changed. It was always the same shade of smoke, the same smear of ruin, the same promise of another battlefield waiting. And when the faint rumble of troopships rose in the distance, vibrating through the ground like the heartbeat of some enormous beast, we knew what it meant. Not reprieve, not respite. Only redeployment. The engines roared to life, shaking the air with their hunger. And we braced ourselves for the cycle to begin again. Because in the Imperium, the march never ends. The roll call begins long before dawn. Voices barked into the chill, lists of numbers rather than names, each syllable echoing through the fog like a hammer striking steel. We stand, shoulders pressed together, weapons slung low, listening not for recognition but for absence. One more voice missing from the line, one more shape swallowed by the void of record-keeping. The Munitorum will not mourn them. Their names will not be etched into marble on Terra. They vanish into paper, to ash, into the silence between Vox transmissions. And yet even stripped of identity, we remain. That is the cruel arithmetic of the Imperium. The individual erased so that the whole might march unbroken. The irony lies in the details we cling to. The gouged marks of the Imperial Aquila carved into bunker walls, sometimes with bayonets, sometimes with bare fingernails when no blade remains. A bird with broken wings, scratched into stone, declaring stubborn faith where liturgy fails. Around ration fires, men and women who cannot recall their own homeworlds laugh at jokes they have told 100 times. Chewing through nutrient bricks that taste of rust and dust, a hymn half-remembered drifts on the smoke, fragments of high Gothic words distorted into soldiers' slang, even as nameless cogs in a war machine too vast to comprehend. We defy erasure through these small acts, a shared glance, a crude song, the touch of fingers against worn metal charms pressed into palms before another charge. There is a nobility in such endurance, though none would admit it aloud. To survive another night, when artillery makes the earth itself shake. To shoulder the lasgun, when arms tremble from hunger. To wake when every bone begs to stay still in the mud. These are not the triumphs of parades or laurels. These are victories measured in breaths stolen from inevitability. The galaxy does not know us. It will not pause to mark our passage. But our lives, faceless as they are, sustain its continuity. A war without soldiers, nameless or not, cannot continue. And so we march, we hold, we endure, because without us, even the Imperium's endless war would falter. Sometimes, I wonder if this is the Emperor's true test, not the valor of heroes clad in golden plate, but the endurance of the forgotten who hold the line no matter the cost. No one prays to be invisible. No one dreams of being unremembered. Yet invisibility is its own armor, shielding us from the despair of expectation. No medals weigh our chests. No statues bear our features. We exist only in the present moment, the breath, the march, the shot fired. Perhaps that is what makes us essential. The whistle of incoming shells cuts across the thought. We scatter without panic, bodies moving with the drilled rhythm of survival. Dirt rains down, smoke curls into the sky, and when the earth settles, the roll is called again. The commissar's voice carries, sharp as a blade. We rise to it. Not for glory, not for recognition, simply because the war demands it, and because, faceless or not, we are still here, nameless, unseen, but unbroken. The dawn comes without color. A gray wash of light spreads over the trenches, painting the scarred earth in shades of ash and ruin. We rise because habit compels us, not hope. The air tastes of promethium and burnt soil, the remnants of yesterday's battle clinging to our tongues. There is no illusion of victory here. Survival is not a banner raised high, but a delay one more day stolen from the fate that waits patiently for us all. Each of us knows, though none speak it aloud, our bodies will break. Whether beneath the crackling sting of less fire, the bone-splintering thunder of artillery, or the weight of endless marches that grind marrow into dust, it is only a matter of time. Tomorrow is always a burden, heavier than the gears strapped to our backs, and yet, in that certainty, there is strength. To live another hour is to defy inevitability. To see another sunrise over fields that should have consumed us is to spit in the face of a galaxy determined to erase us. Even our silence is resistance. Every scar etched into our flesh is a record the administratum will never keep. Proof that we stood when the universe would have preferred we fall. It is not glory, it is endurance, stripped bare of ornament, an ember kept alight against the wind. Around us, the battlefield groans with its own memories. The earth still smolders where shells tore it open. Shattered vox grills hiss with static, whispers of orders half heard and half lost. The sky itself hangs broken above, clouds slashed apart by firestorms, stars hidden behind the pall of smoke. Under such a sky, we are little more than shadows. Forgotten faces pressed into a tide of war that never recedes. And yet we remain scarred, hollow-eyed, breathing. Our very presence defies the abyss that would claim us. Some whisper prayers to the Emperor. Though their voices are cracked and thin, unsure if he listens across the endless void, others mutter rumors that the astronomicon itself flickers, its light straining against the dark. Perhaps those are lies. Perhaps they are truths too terrible to accept. It does not matter. Faith and despair braid together here, indistinguishable strands, woven into the same rope that binds us to this life. Whether out of belief or stubborn defiance, we rise when ordered, we march when commanded. We endure when reason says endurance is impossible. The commissar's voice cuts once more through the haze. Reading the fresh orders, the words echo like the tolling of a bell, heavy, final, inescapable. Another redeployment. Another front. Another tomorrow to carry on our shoulders like a stone too heavy to put down. We glance at one another, eyes hollow yet alive, bound together in the knowledge that our survival is not for ourselves. It is for the Imperium, for a machine that breathes only because we do. Forgotten as we are, faceless as we are, our resistance sustains it. So we stand beneath the broken sky, scarred and weary, not triumphant but unyielding. Our survival is not glory. It is the refusal to vanish. And as the Vox crackles with new commands, as the engines of troop ships rumble in the distance, we shoulder the burden once more. Tomorrow waits heavy and merciless, but still we march into it. Still we resist. Still we endure. The march into eternity begins again.